Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take another look at our for loops in Matlab, and specifically, we are going to combine a little bit of logic with one of our for loops so that we can essentially assign values or determine values or pick values out of a numeric vector. And in this particular example, we're just going to keep track of how many particular values match a criterion. So this video assumes a couple of things that you've been watching some of the earlier videos, particularly on how to create vectors with functions in Matlab, also how to use a for loop in Matlab, and then also on how to use if statements in Matlab. If you have not yet done so, I would encourage you to go back and take a look at some of the earlier videos. And so to begin with, what I'd like to do is I'd like to pull up the help for the rand_n function. Now, we talk a little bit in another video about why we would use the random number generators to essentially test our algorithm in the absence of actual data. And this is a great example of this. In other words, basically what we want to do is we simply want to use the rand_n function to be able to generate essentially a collection of values that we can then apply an algorithm to. In this case, basically what we're going to do is we're just going to look for the number of positive and negative values. And I'm going to go ahead and include 0 in with positive values for this particular demonstration. And if you don't necessarily remember what the rand_n function does, why don't we take just a second to go ahead and show you down here in the command window, and that I'm going to create a 1×10 vector of random numbers. Now, keep in mind, these are going to be double. They're going to be centered around 0, and you're going to get both positive and negative numbers. Now, what we'd like to do is we'd simply like to count how many positive and how many negative values we have. And there's a couple of different ways that you can go about doing this, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine an if statement with a for loop so that we have sort of selective behavior. And so before we forget what we're doing, let's make a couple of notes here. We're going to use rand_n to generate a normalized distribution of numbers, and specifically of doubles. And let me get my help out of the way here a little bit. I'm going to try to keep it up here, but I don't want it to block what we're doing. And then what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to count positives plus 0 and negative. And again, you'll see why in just a second, why I'm wording it this way. It's just for simplicity's sake. We don't want to make this example too terribly long. Now, to begin with, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and use the rand_n function to generate a 1×10 vector that I'm just simply going to store into a vector variable called values. And again, I'm going to leave the semicolon off just so we can see the output in the console. And you can see that each time I run the rand_n function, I'm going to get different values. So your values are probably going to be different from mine as well. So don't worry too much about that. Instead, what we want to do is we want to focus on how many of each positive and negative values we have. And so you can see here as we just quickly scan through here that I have 1, 2, 3 positive values, and the rest of them are negative. And that's good because we have a sort of an uneven distribution, and that's actually really good for our testing purposes. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to set up a for loop that leverages that values vector. And that what we're going to do here is then simply have for value equal to values, and then our end. And if you aren't familiar or comfortable with this syntax here, I just want to remind you that basically this is the equivalent of running the rand_n function on the right-hand side of this equal sign. We could combine these two steps, and then the only reason I'm doing it this way is I'd like to actually keep track of the values vector itself, just for the purposes of being able to easily see what values we have. Now, what we'd like to do is we'd like to throw in an if statement that simply checks to see if our value is greater than or equal to 0, and then the else, and then the end. And remember that the else here, it's implied because we're not explicitly testing it, but effectively what this is this is going to be that a value is less than 0, 0. And again, because we only have two conditions here, in other words, we basically are either going to return a true or false with the way we've worded this. We only have two buckets, two containers, two groupings, however you want to think of it. We don't necessarily have to have an else if and multiple else, and then an else. So in other words, basically, if it's not positive or 0, well, then it's going to be a negative. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to do two things. I'd like to keep track of how many of each I have, and then ultimately I'd like to store only the negatives together and then only the positives together. So to accomplish that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create two variables for counting purposes. The first one is going to be negative underscore count, and I'm going to initialize that to 0. And then I'm going to have the same thing for a positive count. And so positive count equal to 0. And again, just make sure that you spell these correctly so that we don't have any problems later on in the script. And now every time we encounter a value that is greater than or equal to 0, we simply increment the positive count by saying positive count is equal to positive count plus 1. And likewise, the negative count equal to negative count plus 1. And then finally, outside of the for loop, we simply want to have a display combined with an sprintf, where I just do a nice job of printing out those results. So we'll start off here. Let's say we want to display the positive count first, equal to %d, and then in that placeholder, then I'm simply going to insert whatever the value of that variable is, positive count variable, and then a little bit of selective copying and pasting here. We can do the same thing now with the negative. So the idea is I just want to be able to determine how many of each I have found, and provided that we counted them correctly earlier in the video, then we should get the right results in our two displays. So let's go ahead and highlight and run this real quick. And you'll see that, yes, in fact, we did get 3 positive values and 7 negative values. It's always good to know that we can, in fact, count correctly. That's always confidence inspiring. You can also guess now why I use these smaller vectors is because they're easier to see on the screen and easier to check. Again, there is nothing about this script that limits us to only having 10 values. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take this a step further, and that I would simply like to store then all of the negatives together, and I would like to store all of the positives together. Again, don't focus too much on the fact that we're using a rand_n function to generate these values. You may get these values from other source in the future. Maybe a colleague sends you a file that you need to iterate through, and so on. So what we'd like to do, though, is we'd like to create then a corresponding set of new vectors, and I'm going to keep the names fairly consistent here. I'm going to call this one negatives, and that's just going to correspond to all the negative values. And then I'm going to have one that calls positives. And the idea is that that's where we're going to store all the positive values. And again, remember that these empty square brackets just simply initialize these as empty numeric arrays, and specifically of type double. And you can see up here in the workspace that I now have negatives and positives, and they are both 0, 0 and of class double. Now, hopefully you can guess how we're going to go about doing this. We are simply going to leverage this positive count variable, much like an index. Remember that it starts off at 0. So the first time you see a positive value, it's going to simply add 1 to it. So the value then is going to be 1. And that also happens to be the smallest available index in a Matlab vector or array. So what we can do now is we can just simply very carefully say positives, parentheses, positive count, equal to whatever that value is. In other words, if you think about it, as we're looping through each of the values, we're going to pull them out of that values vector one at a time. We're going to take a look at it. We're going to see if it is greater than or equal to 0. If it is greater than or equal to 0, we increment the positive count, and then we simply place it into this positives vector for use later on in our script. We're going to do the same thing now with the negatives. And so we're going to leverage our negatives vector that we created just a little while ago, and we're going to use the negative count as a way of incrementing that vector, and we again just simply store whatever value happens to trigger that condition. Now, take a second to note here that this is one of those scenarios where you really can't get around the problem of growing the vector each iteration of the loop. As a matter of fact, this is the warning that Matlab gives us that we handled in an earlier video. It says variable appears to change size on every loop iteration. And again, there really is no great way to get around this. So this is one of those examples where you may have to take a performance hit or a performance penalty. And again, there's some tricks that we can employ, but in this case, the tricks are actually going to be harder or more confusing than simply just letting us have that performance penalty. And then at this point, what we'll do is we'll just simply rerun our script. I'm going to go ahead and avoid running the random number generator again, because I would like to continue to use the first example that we've been using, and then evaluate the expression. And then I'll tell you what, just to prove that something has actually happened here, I'm going to go ahead and clear my console, but I'm not going to clear the workspace. And then I'm going to rerun this one more time. And you can see that our positive count is in fact 3 and our negative count is 7. But more importantly, if you take a look here, we have 2 of our vectors populated. And notice here the size, the negatives vector is a 1/7, which corresponds to the negative count, and the positives vector is a 1/3, which corresponds to the positive count. So that looks promising, means that it looks like we know what we're doing. And then if you look at the positives vector, you'll see that it only has positive values in it. And if you look at the negatives vector, it also only has negative values in it. Now, again, hopefully you can see with this simple demonstration how you can insert if statements inside of for loops. It turns out that you can have all sorts of different combinations, and we'll cover some of those in other videos. But hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.